Hello. So in this video, I'm going to talk about contrast, specifically how contrast can be applied to music and how we can borrow some concepts from visual art like photographs and paintings. So we're probably all familiar with the concept of contrast as it pertains to editing a photo. For example, if we're editing an Instagram photo or something where you increase the contrast slider and all of a sudden everything kind of seems to pop because the sort of edge of a subject becomes much more differentiated between light and dark. But I like to think of contrast as applying more broadly and generally in terms of the difference between two different parameters and how different they are. And that parameter can be anything. So in the visual mediums, we have things like value or the kind of general brightness of something. So if something is very dark against something that's very bright, that's a lot of contrast. But you can have contrast in terms of colors. So colors that are posed on the color wheel or colors that are close together will have different kind of contrast when seen side by side. You can also have contrast in terms of shape. So a circle compared to this complex polygonal concave shape will have a lot of contrast when seen next to each other. You can have contrast in terms of size, so something very big next to something very small. Contrast in terms of detail, so things in the background are usually more simplified and blurred out versus things in the foreground are typically more kind of crisp and detailed. So you can see that any parameter that can be changed, as long as that change is very big, the contrast between those will appear big. And the purpose of contrast is usually to guide your eye when it comes to a visual medium. But of course, we can apply these concepts to music, whereas in music, instead of contrast between things like value and color and shapes, we have other kinds of parameters like the timbre of the sound. So something between like an electric guitar and a flute will have a lot of contrast next to each other. You can have contrast in terms of how sparse the notes are. So for example, if I play something, this is kind of temporally sparse, whereas in time we have very slow changes, versus contrasting that with, there's a contrast between those two elements. You can have contrast in terms of things that are dark and sad and happy. So something like a major contrasting with minor. You can have contrast in terms of dynamics, very soft. And then you can have contrast in terms of low and high. So starting here, then up here. And the way you can apply this is, for example, you can have different sections. So in a visual medium, usually you have sections like the general foreground element and the general background elements. And within those elements, the contrast is usually pretty tame. So for example, if you have a person standing in the front, within that person, the contrast between the elements will be minimal, but the contrast between that foreground element as a whole and the background as a whole will be bigger to make the subject pop out. And you can think of these elements in music in terms of like verse and chorus or like different sections. So you can have the verse be very low, dark, and sparse. And you can have the chorus be higher and brighter and faster and more notes. Just as an extreme example, but obviously contrast can be calibrated. You don't always have to have this extreme contrast. So it all depends on how much you want things to pop out and stand out. You can also think of contrast as not something very literal like the volume. It can also be applied to subject matter like in your lyrics. So you can have the contrast of singing about something happy in the verse and then something sad in the chorus, for example. Or you can have how far apart your words are or how dark and harsh the words sound compared to more softer sounding words. You can, any parameter that you can think of that you can change within a song, the more you change those parameters that are next to each other, the more contrast there will be. And again, you can use this as a tool to kind of draw attention to different parts. And then you can obviously have contrast between the lyrics and the melody. So you can have a very happy melody or happy chords, but sing something dark versus, and then in chorus, you can maybe switch that up, play something dark, but sing something happy. And that creates this element of kind of absurdity. And you can hear this a lot in older music. One clear example is Maxwell's Silver Hammer by the Beatles, whereas everything is very happy and joyful in terms of the music, but the lyrics are very dark and kind of murderous. So yeah, let me go through some examples of some photographs and paintings that I like, and maybe we'll talk about some of these concepts. All right, so the first one is this photograph by Diane Arbus, and you can see that the boy in the front is very clearly differentiated from the background in terms of contrast, in terms of depth of field and value. Everything in the back is kind of bright and blurred out versus he's very in focus and darker in the front. But then within the background as a whole, the general contrast is very minimal except for that tree and the woman in the back. Everything is kind of muted and grayed out. And obviously this is harder to achieve in photography because you're not placing the element, you're not creating the elements, you're kind of working by taking a snapshot, quite literally, of the existing world. And the analog for this in the music world would be sampling. So a photograph is to painting like sampling is to synthesis, if you will, very loosely speaking. Whereas in sampling, you're kind of starting with an existing framework and you're taking a snapshot of that, similar to photography. So you can apply the concepts of contrast in your sampling as well by selectively picking parts that have contrasting elements between them. All right, moving on. Here we have a painting, the famous Girl with the Pearl Earring. Again, very obvious example of contrast, whereas the foreground element is very bright and colorful and the background is just pure black. So here we have an extreme example. And then again, within the background, there's no contrast. It's all black. And within the foreground, the contrast is very minimal between her skin, the shirt and her hair. Everything is kind of harmonic and cohesive. So you can apply these concepts to your music as well, again, where you can maybe have a verse that is very plain and simple and almost silent, like the black background. And then maybe your verses can pop out, or choruses can pop out and make them literally brighter by playing brighter sounds. But within the chorus, you can maybe minimize the contrast between the elements so that things don't stand out within the chorus, so that the chorus as a whole stands out compared to the verse or the rest of the background. And yeah, that's the extreme case of contrast. If you have zero contrast, it's in a painting, it's almost like having a blank canvas. And in music, the equivalent would be a silent piece like 433. And if you're starting with a blank canvas and you just add one red dot, for example, that's a very obvious contrast in terms of color, value, and shape. And you can apply this to music as well. You can have maybe a section of pure silence and then this crescendo bang in the middle, which kind of grabs your attention. So again, the amount of contrast you put in depends on what kind of effect you're going with. And the more elements you add with differing contrast, the more the contrast as a whole gets amplified. So for example, you can have, like I said before, contrast in terms of sparse notes and dense notes. You can have happy, sad. You can have low dynamics, high dynamics, play low, play high. And if you combine all those together, and you can also have contrast in terms of like dissonance. So you can have something consonant and then. So again, this all goes down to emotion. And I have two examples here that are really interesting. So this is the Persistence of Memory, very famous painting. And here what I like is obviously you have the obvious kind of contrast in terms of value and color, but also there's contrast in terms of kind of reality and surrealism or like absurdity, if you will, where you have these like melting clocks in the foreground, but like a realistic mountain in the background. So again, I like to think of this in music as well, where you can maybe have, let's say you have lyrics about somebody walking down the street, and then maybe in the middle, all of a sudden you talk about this like purple elephant flying in the sky, which creates this very large contrast in terms of the lyrics and the subject matter. You can also apply this musically, maybe in terms of dissonance or just weirdness, basically just stepping out of the box and creating something that is very non-traditional. So you can have like a simple C major, and then you can add lots of crazy dissonance. And again, this all comes down to what emotion you're trying to convey and where you're trying to bring the listener through. Another one I like is The Kiss by Klimt. And what's cool here is that the overall contrast is very minimal. Like if you blur your eyes, it looks like a giant wash of like golden green and just kind of noise, if you will. But there's still contrast there, but it's much more subtle and subdued. The real stronger contrast is when you start to zoom in. So if you look at the details in a very close region, there's a lot of contrast between the flowers and the patches on the clothing. And you can apply this to your music as well. You can think of your overall contrast throughout your whole song being very muted and subdued. But then when you zoom into any given note or section, you can increase the contrast in kind of micro regions there as well. Here's another beautiful photograph by Robert Frank. And in this case, very obvious kind of contrast between the coffee cup and the rest of the photograph. What's cool here is that the subject almost feels like is more blended in the background, and the coffee cup almost feels like the primary subject, even though you can argue that it's the person drinking the coffee. So this is another concept you can apply to your music, where you can grab an element that isn't typically seen as the focal point and make that the focal point by driving up the contrast there. And this could be anything between in terms of lyrics or chorus. You can maybe have your verses be more impactful than your chorus. Why not? Just flip things on its head. Or you can have some random element. For example, you can maybe do it lyrically, where you have a love song, and then in the middle of the love song, you talk about a tree or something. And then maybe you can have contrast in the part where you talk about the tree to really highlight that. And it creates this weird, interesting contrast where you would expect the focus to be on the people who are in love, but you're all of a sudden talking about this random tree, which is kind of equivalent here, where you have this coffee cup, which is kind of center stage. And then we have two photographs here by Henri Cartier-Bresson. Again, very obvious contrast in terms of the cyclist here and this little boy standing here. And yeah, you can apply different elements here. With the one with the boy, there's kind of two layers of contrast, where you have the sort of left wall and shadow in contrast with the back wall and the right sunlit areas. And that kind of divides the piece in two. And then you have the contrast that makes the boy pop out. And again, you can apply this to your music as well. You can maybe have half your song be one kind of mood and half be another, but then also highlight with another layer of contrast, highlight the main subject matter. So you can have kind of intersecting contrasts. You can have global kind of macro contrast and then micro contrast when you zoom in. So yeah, that's all I had to say about that. Hopefully that was interesting. So yeah, if you feel like you're stuck in your songwriting, maybe think about contrast. Think of any kind of parameter you can change: timbre, tempo, the lyric subject matter, the density of the words, the way you pronounce the words. Anything that can be changed, the more drastic the changes between two kind of temporal events, the more contrast there will be, and you can use that as a tool to kind of guide people through your music. Yeah, let me know if you want me to cover other kinds of subjects. We can talk about composition and other kinds of visual elements and how they apply to music as well. So yeah, this is something I'm going to be thinking about more and more, and I'll try to bring it up as I go when I'm doing my more songwriting type of videos. All right, thanks so much for watching. I'll catch you guys in the next.